Mr. Bernstein.
Yes, indeed. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tinderbox Meetup with Michael Becker. I'm Mark Bernstein, designer of Tinderbox, and this is Sunday, February 18th, 2024. Today we will have a special guest speaker coming up, Chris Aldrich, who is a bioengineer and who's finishing a book on the entertainment representation business. So he's a man of parts. If you're not already on the Eastgate list where we announce new meetups, new releases, and things like that, sign up at eastgate.com or the Tinderbox page, which is eastgate.com/Tinderbox. Meetup announcements, recordings, and summaries are all available at the Tinderbox forum, forum.eastgate.com. There's also an online calendar there where you can subscribe and add Tinderbox meetups to your own calendar automatically. We'll put that URL in the chart. Reminder, next Saturday, we have a special meetup on weblogs and Tinderbox with Dave Rogers and Jack Beatty. There's a huge return, and I think an important return to weblogs underway now that everyone sees the danger of Twitter and Facebook and the like. So don't miss next Saturday. Without further delay, here's Michael Becker.
Hey, everybody. Awesome. Really looking forward to today's talk. Just a bit overview of how we handle our meetups for those first-time users. We go around the room and first-time users can introduce themselves if they so choose. We have a lot of first-timers today. So if you want to kind of tell us how you're using Tinderbox and what you're using it for, that would be great. But before we go into that, we then will jump into our, if we have one, which we do today with Chris Aldrich on Tools for Thoughts. We will then tend to also address anybody's puzzlements about using Tinderbox, personal knowledge management, thoughts, ideas, and strategies, if time permitting. We're going to skip a lot of that today simply because we want to get as much time as we possibly can with Chris and take advantage of that. We have kicked off over the last few weeks a new 10 minutes with Tinderbox training session, of which today Mark Anderson is going to do for us. And he's going to be sharing a quick review on how to use shortcuts in Tinderbox, which is could be handy for those that want to keep their fingers on the keyboard. But Mr. Bernstein, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just one thing. If anyone would like to sign up for the announcement list, just put your email in the chat, make it a private chat if you're shy about sharing your email, and I'll take care of the rest.
Perfect. And then there was something else I was going to ask you, but that's fine. All right, so great. So real quick, before we jump into the 10-minute training, does anybody new want to introduce themselves and give a brief overview of how you're using Tinderbox and just kind of why you're here? All right, Theodore, go for it.
How's it going, everybody? Thank you for this opportunity. I came to Tinderbox many years ago, and I came to a workshop in 2006 in Watertown, and ironically, I was partially employed. I'm mainly a cellist and a viola da gambist, but I do work in technology. At the time, I was working for Pfizer, and information technology and Tinderbox lit me up. I was so excited about this program, and only when I drove past my viola da gamba in Watertown, basically across the street from where Tinderbox was born, I started following again, and I'm just thrilled to be here. I have a question about how to organize an archive that is currently at the Library of Congress. And I'm just happy to listen. And at some point, if I can advance that question, I would love that.
All right, I'll drop in my email too. Maybe we can have a side chat if we don't get to it today. And you can, and what I would also encourage you to do is create a thread on the Tinderbox forum.
Okay.
And ask the question: How do I organize a my material? And if you could start with the what's your primary question and objective? why do you want to organize it, that kind of thing, and and then the community will help you figure that out.
Thank you very much. I'd love to do
Yeah,
that.
and actually, Tom Norris just posted one on how to manage that company the history of companies from like the mid 1800s. It looks like it's a project
Wow.
he's working on. So similar thread that you might want to take a look at.
Thank you very
All
much.
right. Anybody else new? I think Eric's new. We haven't seen Lisa in a long time. Haven't seen Barry in a long time. You guys want to comment, or shall we just get moving on?
I guess I'll just comment
All
real
right.
quick. I am new.
Yeah, please.
Actually clued me into this. I'm Tinderbox curious, I guess is the way I put it. I've been aware of it for many, many years. I think I probably downloaded and poked early, but I'm cross-platform, so it's been a little tricky, but I'm curious to look and see what more I can learn.
Okay. And Frederick, there is a way to do that, and I will. Why don't I drop the response to that in the chat once we get Chris going? I'll kind of write a little script for you on the side and show you how to do that. I'm responding in the chat. Frederick had a question: is there a way to change the icon for an event note when checked to the show visually? And the answer is yes. You can use a little bit of action code, and I'll write that up real quick. Anybody else? All right. If not, let's turn our 10 minutes in Tinderbox over to Mr. Anderson. Perfect.
Okay. Did you want to do the main event first, or because?
No, let's just do it. Or shall we do the main event first? And
I think do the main event first, and
one.
then because it's better that way. Because I can always fill, or it can go to slide to another week if we get to
Yeah. Okay. Or if yeah, let's take advantage of Chris being here. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Hopefully we haven't checked audio, so hopefully my audio works.
Yes, it's perfect.
I'm glad my camera's working well. So I am a Tinderbox user from way back in the day. But because of platform changes, I left it off, not before I didn't have gray hair, but it has been a long time. These days, most of my practice is actual index cards, but I do tinker around with a handful of other tools. One of my day-to-day drivers is Hypothesis, which I appreciate for there's some UI issues I think people have run into, but I appreciate the fact that it will put an overlay right next to the thing I'm reading and marking up and having a conversation with. And then I think I probably tinkered with almost every tool on the planet that fits into kind of the broader competitive space for taking notes. I've spent a lot of time over the past 5 or 6 years playing around in intellectual history. So I have looked at note-taking practices going back not only multiple thousands of years, but I'm also looking into practices around orality and how indigenous peoples have taken notes, but they, lacking writing, obviously do things in dramatically different ways, primarily using their heads and memory. So in some sense, I am in the midst of linking together oral practices with literate practices and looking at what those two have in common, how they're different, and probably most importantly for those of us here, how can you use those now in your daily life, whether you want to focus on orality or what we call in the Western tradition, mnemonic techniques, mnemonic practice. And when I am generally talking about mnemonic techniques, I'm not using the super low level 2nd and 3rd grade version of that, but more advanced ideas like memory palaces or the major system, which is out there and possibly not talked about as much as some, as well as a wealth of slowly uncovering indigenous practices from modern people who are alive today and who use these things. So ideas like song lines in Australia, as an example. So hopefully today I'm going to try and I'll open it up to make this more of a conversation, although I'm going to specifically not watch the chat. So if something interesting happens in chat, I'll rely on Michael or Mark or someone to wave the red flag, or if you have a question, pop in and we'll try and address it in the moment. Having been to a number of Tinderbox meetups in the past, I have seen some people talk about broad practices, whether they're Tinderbox users or not. I'm going to start at a much more advanced level because I see a room full of people who some have probably been taking notes longer than I have. But I have looked at, and I don't know, as I watch things like some fora online, people will always be asking questions. How do I do this with this tool? Or how do I do that? And generally they know what they want to do and how they want to do it. There's another level below that, a lot of people who they have no idea what they're doing at all. And I'm going to try and stay away from that crowd because I don't think that's who this is. And there are thousands of other great resources for them to pull up. But I'm going to try and touch on some of kind of the broader practices that you may notice as you're tooling along and taking notes or writing and working on projects. So even small things like, somebody a few minutes ago asked a question about how do I massage a database into a specific form to find some answer or do some research. And I want to try and kind of stay away from some of those, what I would consider easy mechanics, and delve more deeply into the longer tail of what these tools for thought kind of look like. And I do this too because as a youth in 6th grade, I think that was 1986, will date me terrifically. I had a teacher who tried to teach me how to use index cards to write a short essay. And at the time I was writing about Alexander Hamilton, before he was famous and anybody knew who he was. My wife's giving me a dirty look because she's a big Hamilton fan. But it was never told to me what the long-term practice of taking notes and using your notes on a regular basis looked like. And because I had a phenomenally good natural memory, and this was before I even started delving into mnemonic techniques, I didn't see the point. So I could read a handful of books, a few magazine articles, and just re-vomit up the story that I had consumed. Now, if you ask me 40 years later, how much of that story do I remember? Pieces of it, certainly. In particular, a piece involving a gun, but all of the small details are now lost to me because I didn't put those into a long-term storage. So if I wanted to go back to the idea of Alexander Hamilton and his life outside of popular culture, I would have to restart from scratch, more or less. But having had a much more specific pride, and even into college, I was what was considered the weirdo who sat in class and never took a single note. And it scared the hell out of people. He must be a super genius. And I did fairly well. But I also happened to be working mostly in engineering and math spaces where mentally I'm building a scaffold internally to hang everything on. And that makes things a lot easier. It's much harder. And I think in some sense, a lot of the note-taking traditions we have exist because the humanities have ensconced them in amber over time. So you can go back and find manuals on writing notes that easily go back to Erasmus in the 1500s, or Philip Melanchthon, or Richard Agricola. You know, they're harder to read now because most of us don't read Latin. In fact, I saw the other day that I think the first mention of the word commonplace book in the English language appears in the context of the writing of John Donne, who was in the 1517 onwards. But commonplaces had been around since ancient Greece and Rome, just under different monikers. And I think a lot of the tools for thought space, or at least those that I see online, totally miss the history of where we've been, which I think is a dramatic disservice to not only us individually, but society as a whole. So as a very concrete example, you can look back to 1945 and see Vannevar Bush's Atlantic Monthly article in July 1945, As We May Think. And he talks about and kind of invents a thing called the Memex, which he kind of builds as a desk with a lot of microfiche in it that sounds a lot like what the modern internet is. Sadly, he totally erases thousands of years of history, possibly because he, like I, was an engineer and didn't see the point. But because he doesn't mention words like Florilegia or commonplace book or locus communis, the entirety of the generation of engineers that follow him are really reinventing the wheel all over again. But you can look at the work of, you know, sociologists like Beatrice Webb, who was one of the founders of the London School of Economics. She's working in the late 1800s, and in her autobiography in section C in the appendix, she has a section on writing notes. And if you read that, whether you're a computer scientist or not, you will easily pick up the fact that she's talking about creating databases. So she's using written notes on slips. I think she used probably slightly larger ones, although she doesn't specify. But she's using index cards and creating, for her, a database and using that to analyze data. So she's recreating Excel in paper format and using it to answer questions, write books, inform policy in the late 1800s. And of course, she doesn't write that part of her autobiography. It doesn't come out until 1926. But as I read, it's patently obvious to me that she's talking about databases. She just doesn't have that word or with that vocabulary that we now have in the modern age. So starting from kind of that base, one of the people I like to look back at from a historical perspective, because he ties in a lot of these practices, is an 11th century polymath by the name of Raymond Lull. L-L-U-L-L is how he spells his name, and his name has about 47 variations that I've run across in text, because he's writing in Latin, Spanish, Catalan. He's got a half a dozen languages he's writing on, and then people since then have written about him in 10 other languages and butchered and changed his name 4 ways to Sunday. I think in my note-taking practices, I have more aliases for his name than anything else. It's a weird database all in itself. But he was writing and working in a time where paper was not common in the 11th century. He certainly had other methods, but the vast majority of what he was doing was done mentally. So he was creating memory palaces and using Ars Memoria, to memorize everything that he did. Fascinatingly to me, he was forcing some structure onto his thoughts and memories. He was meditating on them in some sense, the way that I don't think any of us sit and meditate on our written notes or writing practices. But I think there's some benefits of what he did. And probably the best way to describe it, because it gets pretty hairy pretty deeply, especially if you go back and read his original writing. But if you imagine a very simple Caesar cipher encoder ring that you would pull out of a box of cereal in the 1950s that matches up the alphabet A through Z and the numbers 1 through 26, and you can spin them around and change them. He was using a tool similar to that, but associated with the numbers 1 through 26, he had in his memory thoughts that he was working on regularly. And similarly associated to all the letters A through Z, another set of thoughts. If you look up the phrase lull and wheels, you'll find an idea of kind of what his specific practice looked like, and he physically drew it out in some of his writings. But if you imagine taking that decoder ring and twisting it, and maybe the number 10 matches up with the letter F at the time you're doing it, you then take those two ideas and you sit and you think about them in juxtaposition for a while. You meditate on them and you see what new ideas come out of it. If it's something useful, you then memorize that or add that to your memory palace in your mind, and you continue on. And fortunately, he had enough money and resources that he could write things down on and pass them down on parchment. So we have records of all that. Sadly, we do not have, and the same issue exists with all the indigenous cultures around the world who are slowly and surely ever erased. We don't have records of their memories because they weren't written down. But we have examples of things that surely were used as mnemonics for them. So, there's a tool called a kipu that's a long string with knotted ties coming off of it, sometimes colored, sometimes not. And cultures in South America used these and memorized their knowledge against them. So laws, accounting. The issue is they act like a book to the person who knows how to read the book. And now linguistically, we can usually find, a tablet or a stone in some random language, and we can figure out and puzzle out what it is and what it may have meant. But with Kipu, it's much more difficult because we don't know the system that was used to map the knowledge in someone's brain to the tool that they were using. And to kind of bring this back into modern context, we all do this every day to some extent. In fact, somebody asked me, we were talking about, Niklas Luhmann talks about a spirit in his Zettelkasten, and it's something he imputed as external to himself, but really it's internal because you're using your notes and what you're writing as an extension of yourself. And I always think of my past self, my current self now, and my future self. And most of my notes I'm writing for a version of my future self. So your box is never thinking for you, although I have seen people writing about it as if it did, or people will use the word autopoiesis, but really the living thing is inside your head and you're interacting with it. So to steal a phrase from Shakespeare, where is knowledge bred? in the box or in the head, or in the tinderbox or in the head, I guess I should say here. It's your interaction with the thing that kind of reignites what Vannevar Bush would call the associative trails of where you've been and where you're going. But if you're Raymond Lull in the 11th century, you don't even have really, or you don't quite have the affordance and the benefit of taking two index cards with things written on both and saying, how can I compare this to this and what can I get out of that? And what grows out of that. So I'll pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions or comments. I'm kind of curious if anybody has their own significant mnemonic practices that they use. Because I'd like to kind of delve into that as we go forward. Don't be shy. All right.
I mean,
so,
minor mnemonics everybody does have, right? I mean, most of my tagging system, for example, will use acronyms or short forms just so that I don't have to waste space looking at them. If I use, 3 A's, I know it's urgent. I don't have to use up 5 letters, for example.
yeah. Well, it's one of those things too, even the giving a name to something, in indigenous cultures, a name has power, and it has power for a reason. If I can give a name to, he used the phrase lull and wheels, or it's used in the space, but I have seen various incarnations of what I consider to be lull and wheels across intellectual history. And none of them have great names, and there is no cohesive space. So I have given them the name combinatorial creativity, which kind of takes what Lull was doing and creating a generative space. He was taking combinations of things and then turning that into new creative ways of doing things. But by giving it a name and calling it combinatorial creativity, and you can go to my hypothesis account and find that, and there's got to be hundreds of notes on various versions of how to do that, even to modern day versions of things like, so WordPress, for example, has a random page generator that you can go to WordPress site and type in a custom thing and it will give you a random page from that person's blog. I used to use that and take 2 random pages from my own website, which to a great extent functions as a commonplace book for me, and put 2 things together and look at them. Or Obsidian has a little plugin that will give you 2 or 3 random notes so you can sit and meditate on what they are. Do they have a connection? Do they not? What comes out of it? I see Mark and Theodore with hands up.
I'll jump in. You were asking about
Yeah.
mnemonic devices. My first thought was, being a musician, the solfege syllables, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, which are a storage of just a specific pitch, obviously, or maybe 3 if there's flats and sharps. But the idea is that all music fits into these little mnemonics, and it's a way of reading music in different clefs and all this, and also sort of memorizing music so that it becomes this very what's the word, agile storage system for all this. So that would one of the things that I was thinking of, as you mentioned.
Yeah, in fact that music has a huge amount of mnemonic space over it. One of the older versions I've seen is probably from the 1100s, called the Guidonian hand. And you can find in old manuscripts pictures of a physical hand with, the keys and letters on them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's where it all came from.
But there are also as well too, and what kills me is so much of it is invisible, but even in indigenous peoples in modern day Australia, they have what are known as song lines, which are roughly equivalent to modern memory palaces that Westerners would use. So they're tying your location in space to particular ideas so that you can have long-term memories. So let's say if I'm driving to the store today and I need to remember to buy bread and milk, I literally will picture the store I'm going to go buy it at and associate those images with my local grocery store has a painting with a weird little monkey on the front wall of the grocery store. So I will, in my mind, imagine that monkey doing really obscene things with a handful of things I can't possibly forget to buy or my wife will be upset. And so this monkey does all sorts of unspeakable things to these items. And then when I'm at the store, I can't help but remember, as I see that monkey walking through the front door, the 4 or 5 things I need to remember. And then you can pick up all the rest of the stuff as you walk by because, oh, I don't have that in my pantry maybe. But the things your wife is going to be upset at you for not picking up, you make the extra mental effort and go from there. Some cultures would do that same thing, but they would do it with song. And as an example, I went on a school field trip with my daughter this week to a mosque where the gentleman who gave us the tour said he spent about 4 years and memorized the entirety of the Quran, which is a common practice in Islam. And if all the Quran in the entirety of the world were destroyed overnight magically, it would take about 2 hours for a handful of people to recreate it from scratch with no issues, no problems, no fidelity. And in some sense, there are sets of rules they use for not only memorizing, but intoning and speaking the poetry in the Quran that makes it much easier for you to memorize it. That type of thing happens in all types of cultures. In the West, it was well known and well documented, particularly by Milman Perry, who was the first professor of English at Harvard, went and documented native singers in Czechoslovakia and how they memorized epic poetry and sang. And he then mapped that modern practice from the early 1900s to the practice of oral singers who memorized and sang the entirety of Homer. So, a lot of these practices go way back without writing a single word down. And it always nearly infuriates me. And one of the most quoted phrases I see from Sanka Aaron's book that he draws from Niklas Luhmann is, without writing, there is no thought, which patently on its face is just terribly wrong. Yes, it's helpful and it's a good tool, but you can think without writing things down. You just have to know how to do it. And most of the West has lost that practice in some sense. Did you have a question, Mark?
Yeah, I was wondering in this connection, what you think of the famous essay, The Extended Mind, Clark and Chalmers, I believe, which is the rather respectable origin of all the discussion of the second brain or the outboard brain. I've always been skeptical of the latter, but the former is a pretty good essay.
I love the essay, and for those who don't want to get into the deep weeds, there's a good book called The Extended Mind that came out, I want to say June or July in 2022. That kind of touches on that and expands on the broader area of psychology that kind of follows that. I want to say too, somebody probably put it in the list of books from the end of the Tinderbox meetup in December, I think is hiding in there. I will, for those who want it, I have a fairly large Zotero bibliographic selection. I'll give everyone a link to it. And it's got probably more stuff in intellectual history and tools for thought than you can shake a stick at. So to look at it as a big thing will be stupidly daunting, but I'm happy to, if you have particular areas of interest, ask me and I can direct you to subsections of that bibliography, because you see it and you don't think there is that much that's going to be there, or yeah, a couple hundred things, but not thousands and thousands, and certainly not things that go into cultural archaeology, anthropology, and all kinds of other, and there's some stuff in the area of even medicine where these things pop up. And it still boggles my mind that every day I throw 4 or 5 new references into at least my private version, not the public version, that there is always more in that space. But by throwing things into even a Zotero collection, that's a database of a digital database of my notes of all the crazy things, either that I want to read or that I have read, and it becomes a set of signposts of what I've been thinking about for the last 4 or 5 years, or even the last 20. Yeah, I think there's easily things in there that go back 20, 25 years. And then prior to that, it's all written. So I'll go to written notes if I need to. Eventually I'll slowly put them all in, but I'm not going to waste the overhead time to do that. But that kind of the extended mind thesis seems interesting and novel. And I want to say it was written in the early 90s.
Late 90s.
Or late 90s, 99, 98, 99, I think. But we have records and can backdate Aboriginal peoples in Australia using things like this as far back as 65,000 years ago. There are stories that have been passed down over generations such that people now can say, yes, there used to be a lake over there, and there is no sign of a lake there now currently, but we can use GPS satellites and imagery from space to map that area and discover that, yes, 65,000 years ago, there was a lake there and it supported and the local people used it. So we can find and tie together examples of those things, or even in the area of archaeoastronomy, there are indigenous stories of things relating to the stars, and stars being in different positions, or planets being in different positions thousands of years ago that a modern person would not know about. Yet those stories exist and we can map them up, and they match almost exactly what you would expect to be able to predict what things would have looked like 10, 15,000 years ago to indigenous people on the planet Earth. In the West, we kind of poo-poo it because we put pejorative words like mythology on them now. But Roman and Greek mythology, in some sense, we were taking ideas and people and mapping them into the sky and using that to remember stories and bits of culture. So we have, even in our own Western mythologies, little bits of knowledge ensconced in amber that we only vaguely recollect now because they're written down and we can read about them. We generally, unless you're like me and you pull out star maps and take your daughter outside, which is very hard in Southern California, where there's 3 clear nights a year, maybe, if you're lucky, at least where I live. It shocks me there's a massive telescope less than a mile from my house, but I can't see any of what it sees because there's a cloud layer blocking all of it. But you can map bits of your culture and stories and knowledge into the stars. And if you're like me or other indigenous cultures, you not only you use those stories as the memory aid to know what's going on and to identify the stars and the things. But then if you're careful about it, you can also map everything you know about Nicholas Luhmann to Cassiopeia and string it all down in associative memory. And in parts of the educated West, we did a lot of this up until about the end of the 1500s. And because I like to vilify him, Peter Ramus was probably one of the educational reformers at the end of the 1500s who helped to wipe away a lot of our mnemonic tradition in the West. He felt that if you could outline and create a structure to remember things, which I almost feel like is a form of nominative determinism, that a guy named Petrus Ramus wants to ramify everything, is a little bizarre to me. But he did it in part because, I won't go further than my example of the monkey and remembering bread at the grocery store, but a lot of these mnemonic techniques use war and blood and extreme things that actually are not that extreme now in a modern media culture. I see worse watching a Spielberg film, than most, 11th century tertiaries would, be able to even picture in their minds. But I use that extremism to remember the things that are going on. And typically, if you have a really brilliant idea that pops up in your head that's central to your work, you're going to remember it because it's so central to who you are and what you're doing. But it's all the other tiny details that you may need to build up and scaffold over time and not need to, take up the space to remember.
So Chris, can I throw in a question on that?
Sure.
So I'd love it if you could also kind of paint the history to that. So I have a friend of mine who's developed a company called My Planet, and what she's done is created a concept called the geotemporal unit. And what she does is she is able to normalize data against people, places, time, and the context or events that were happening around those points, because that's how we memorize. Or that's and her whole point is that's how you remember things. So like I may not remember your name say a year from now, but I'll remember sometime in February we did a meetup with this guy and we talked about memory. And so you could pull up her app and it would drive down and start giving you all those details. Like you'll remember that thing called an event that we did a meetup. And I remember it was in February. So I'll use the date to help me get there. Or I might remember the person's name that will then lead me to the date. And so it seems like that's a lot of like what Tinderbox enables is kind of that hypertext linking, that category theory linking. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of association with the who, what, when, where, what was happening context, and how that ties to our memory?
So, and our friend Vannevar Bush, called those associative trails. So if you're an early indigenous person moving around your environment,
I'm sorry, what did he call it?
Associative trails.
Okay.
So if you can, and essentially it's how, for those who don't know what a memory palace is, you may see versions of it on television. There's a famous reference to it in Silence of the Lambs with Hannibal Lecter that is non-instructive, There are lots of references to it in, I've seen it probably in 2 or 3 versions of Sherlock Holmes. And usually it's more like floating images going by, just random things that presumably his mind has associated the thing he's thinking about to other things. And so you see those things flying by, but that's wholly unuseful as well. But it's easier to think if you walk down your street. And I maybe even a really good example, and I'll you can't go by without mentioning the name of Lynn Kelly, who is she's a polymath who has done a lot of work into indigenous cultures and mnemonic techniques over time. But she has several books that lay out almost as many mnemonic techniques as may have ever existed, or at least all the ones that we currently know. So you can pick and choose which one you want for the thing you need. But as humans, the one tool that we have that has gotten us where we're at is our associative memories. So you can associate one thing with another. Generally, the more excessive or colorful or crazy or zany you make that association, the more likely you are to remember it. But you also then, you don't rely on that, but you rely also on what in modern psychology spaces is called timed repetition. And most of that goes back to the late 1800s with Ebbinghaus. So if the modern school child will use an index card as a flashcard. You practice once today, the things you don't remember well, you review over one more time, and then you come back to them tomorrow, the day after, and then maybe you wait a week, and then you wait 3 months. But you repeat over those things so that you can keep them in your long-term memory. So you're using a little bit of the repetition as well as the associative memory to keep it in long-term practice. But when you think about it from an anthropological perspective, one of the reasons we have holidays is because that's when our cultures and peoples came together, not only to celebrate and have fun, which is always nice, but that was part of the repetition for your mnemonic practice. You walk back through those memory palaces or song lines you've created. You talk about them with your friends, your families, others, or, one can create a structure and evidence whereby, and Lynn Kelly, probably in the most kind of stunning reveal in one of her books, associates Stonehenge as a mnemonic location. The stones and the rocks at Stonehenge are an ancient library, and you can walk up and look at not only the arrangement of the stones creates a physical space, but you can look at spots and flecks and shapes that are carved into or carved on the rock to remember things. So if you wanted to associate all the bones of the human body to one of those specific stones, it would take you less than a day, particularly if you had the whole list. You could memorize it, and every time you walk up to that stone, you in your mind's eye would be able to see all the bones and the names of those bones in the human body associated to that rock. And that's good for a one-off, but for your knowledge to pass from one generation to the next, you then have to teach someone else. So you bring them and you go through that thing, describing the bones of the body and all their names, and you help your student associate those with what's happening on the stone. And then when you come back 4 times a year for all the solstices, or, holidays that happen even in between the solstices. But Stonehenge happens to be one of the bigger and more impressive versions, and less talked about in the archaeological record. There are stone and wooden circles all over Eastern Europe. So you take that knowledge that you learn at Stonehenge and you associate it with that one rock, and then you reassociate it with the thing, the stone circle or the wooden circle in your own village, and you practice that there. But every couple of years you may go back to Stonehenge and pass your knowledge along to someone new who can then take it back to their town or city. And for thousands of years, that's how knowledge gets passed along. And in her book, she makes an incredibly strong argument that using this type of associative memory, this is how cultures have passed down knowledge from A to B without having written it down. And all these cultures, they happen everywhere across the planet. So you'll find, even at Cahokia, versions of what happened at Stonehenge happening there. Or even I'm trying to, through the archaeological record, trying to tie those into where Western culture happens. So you can go to, there's a site in Israel called Khirbet Qumran that is right smack dab in the center of Israel, modern day Israel. And it is an abandoned village that maybe 300 people lived at in the 10th century BCE during the time of King David. And in one of kind of the primary rooms, there is a standing stone in the middle of this room that presumably was used by a leader or priest or teacher within the community. And I'm almost dead sure before pieces of the Old Testament were being written down 400 or 500 years later, whoever lived in that room was using mnemonic techniques associated with that standing stone to write and pass down what we now know as the Old Testament. They were just doing it in an oral fashion. Or there is a small clay, I almost think of it as kind of like a Punch and Judy, stage set. But it's a very interesting miniature version of the original temple. And I'm almost dead certain that the person who had that in their room, and it, was maybe a little bigger than a bread box roughly, but someone was associating cultural memories of the tribe of people who lived there to that thing. Or, we may think of it as kind of hoodoo, voodoo, mysticism when you see in movies or TV, the Indian tribe is going on the warpath. And the night before, they have a song and dance around a fire before they go out on the warpath. They're actually doing something there. They're using the song and the dance and the things they've got associated, the memories associated with battle plans, how to work together to effectuate an attack on an opposing tribe or an attacking tribe. All the things their culture has learned over time, how we're going to carry out this battle, are being reenacted through song and dance the night before. And we think of it as, oh, it's cute entertainment from a Western perspective because we don't know the mnemonic traditions of what's going on there. And to tie it even more directly to the West, we have written records that the Ark of the Covenant, into which the 10 Commandments were placed, was carried before the Israelites into battle. And from a naive Western practice, we think of it as, oh, this is the talisman of our culture and our faith that we're carrying with us into war, maybe like you would a flag or a battle standard. But I would posit that the battle plans and the structure that the leaders were going to effect were encoded into that box, and they carried it around with them because it is a written battle plan of how we're going to go to war, how everybody's going to act and interact, and it becomes it's a quick cheat sheet that we can review over before we actually go to war. And thus they carried it around with them. But we now no longer have a written version or a memory that actually was the case. So it becomes much harder to take that unseen thing and write about it or even talk about it in a modern context, because we just don't see the world that way. But in some sense, when you have taste and smell memories that as you're driving around town, you may remember, oh, a year ago, I remember hearing this same song in this same place. And it's because your associative memory is so strong for those things. Or you may smell something and remember an incident from your early childhood because that smell memory is associated, and it's a very strong one. The secret becomes, how do you leverage those things as tools for remembering the things that are important to you over time? Or and usually when you do this too, it becomes a tool for supercharging your creativity, because to make something extreme or crazy or bizarre, I walk down my street walking the dog, and there is a fence post at which I see Einstein doing an Irish jig in all kinds of a terrible drunken state, let's say. And that makes me think of 5 other things. But every time I walk past that post, I can't help but re-encounter memories of things in the areas where I work, either for mnemonic tradition, oral cultures, note-taking practices, or even mathematical equations. I'm in the midst of a class of all things, rational points on the elliptic curve, which is a super niche area of Diophantine equations. And, it's probably the only class on the planet that's being taught on this thing right now. But as I walk around, I'm taking ideas I have from the math text that I'm working on, and I map them into my local environment. I tell my wife we should never ever leave here so that I don't forget everything I ever learned about some of these weird areas. But I also have written notes that also back those things up. And often, even in my written notes, I'll write a little scribble of where in my neighborhood I may have had that mapped onto. But because I walk my dog every day, it becomes a daily practice. But in some sense, as you're walking through or flipping through your notes, digital or otherwise, you're retracing those associative paths. And as you work on them, even if you've forgotten something, it will usually come back to you much more quickly. And the biggest issue is knowing that these are things you can use to extend your mind out into your environment. But, to sum it back up to Mark's question about the extended mind thesis, people have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. This is nothing new. It's nice that they have written this thesis down, and we're doing more focused research on what it is and delving in. Because that's how you make progress, as you compare one thing to another. This one's better, let's go with this, and then build from there. But usually you don't want to forget what the old thing was, because maybe it comes into play at some later point. How are we doing on time? Somebody's got to tell me when to quit, because we could go on for ages.
Chris, we've got tons of time. We got about half an hour.
Okay.
So,
Oh, good.
but it does make me think of two things real quick before we move on. Let me say them both, and then you can respond. One is, or three things actually. One thing, it sounds like a lot of especially your dog walks. It sounds a lot like a meditative practice. It's like walking Zen is one reaction I'm getting as I'm hearing you talk. The other thing that came to mind was, I'd love to hear your responses and how you think modern technologies like the phone and things like that are affecting our memory. Like I can't remember anybody's phone number at all because I never use it. I just press a button. And then the third thing I wanted to state is you triggered in my mind a study that was done a while back on the bias of choice, the random bias of choice. And for example, if you present two toys in front of a 1-year-old or a baby, the baby will randomly grab a toy and never go back to the first one. So once it rejected that first toy, it will never go back, is what they found over time, given distributions. But they essentially said babies will randomly choose to like something and then never go back to liking the thing that they rejected in the first place. And I wonder how that might have an effect on our memories and the way we take notes and think about things. So those are my three kind of observations, and then we'll let Dave jump in.
So, and obviously I mentioned it earlier, but Raymond Lull was actually, and I always cheat on his name because the double L and the double L is more like a yo, so it's a yo, but that or my Welsh double L pronunciation gets a little hairy, so I'll anglicize it to Lull. He actively was meditating on, and I think many religious through the Middle Ages were actively meditating on usually it was the religious stuff that they had memorized and were going through. In fact, I made a kind of a mean note the other day. I'm reading Dennis Duncan's book Indexed, and he mentions Robert Grosseteste's a book from the 1300s, and there's an illumination in a manuscript of him sitting and giving a sermon to 3 or 4 people, and Duncan mentions there in the image at the very top of the image, it's almost kind of outside the image, there's a pelican. And Duncan says that the bishop is holding up his index finger as if he's telling a story. It's a storyteller's thing. But if you know 2 more things, suddenly there's way more to this going on in this image than you might think. He's not holding his finger up as if he's telling a story. He's literally pointing to the pelican at and above the top of the picture. And that pelican isn't just a pelican. That pelican, from stories of Isidore of Seville in the 7th century, is a representation of the suffering Christ. So that pelican who's disinterested and looking away and not even paying attention actually happens to be a story about Jesus that the bishop is telling the people in front of him. So that pelican represents what his story is about. And it's done in the medieval mind because they have associated that pelican with the suffering of Christ. And I won't get into it, but there's a long series of bad zoology that has created that thing in the medieval mind that just doesn't make sense in modern times with what you know about pelicans. But to somebody in the 1300s, you look at that picture and you know immediately, okay, here's this bishop because he's got a mitre on and a crozier. So he's holding symbols that tell us who he is. And he's obviously keeping a group of people enraptured in a story. But because he's pointing up at a pelican, you know what story he's telling. But associatively, we've lost that. But if you're reading Robert Grosseteste's book at the time and looking at that image, those things enter your mind because you can't help them from not. It's like, the Lakoff's theory, don't think of an elephant, you have to think of it. But those associative memories were so strong, as you're reading this text, you can't help but think of this bishop talking about the suffering of Christ and which has nothing to do with the text at hand, as far as I recall. It was a piece of poetry in which it appears. But you also, as a reader and meditating on these things, you can associate what you read on that page with the image that appears there. So quite often in manuscripts, you'll see the goofiest marginal images of rabbits doing obscene things, or people fighting, or half horse, half man beasts, or weird, bizarre plants in the margins. People were actively taking the ideas in the books they were reading and associating them with those images in the margins. So when you're done, you can kind of flip through the book really quick and you'll see those images, and they not only become pointers at, oh, hey, you could find this thing on this page, but when you see that rabbit doing the obscene gesture, you will have an association with that rabbit with some idea that was on that page, and you'll know and remember it without even needing to do anything more than flipping through your codex. As for phones and phone numbers, you could use the major system and memorize massive lists of numbers if you needed to and wanted to. My guess is, in modern contexts, the usefulness of doing that is fairly limited. I probably got more than 5,000 decimals of pi memorized. But when am I going to need to calculate a presumed circumference of the universe to 1/billionth of a, decimal place to do that? So it's a fun parlor trick, or better, if you're in a modern context, maybe you use that superpower to memorize your way into a 10-deck shoe of cards so that you can win at blackjack. Just don't ever let a casino catch you doing it. But you can easily do that. So for things like phones, I had a calculus teacher once said, I try and limit what I memorize because I'm worried that I'm going to displace my son's name one day, and then I'll have this weird calculus fact, but then won't know who my son is. And broadly, I don't think memory quite works that way. But if you had a direct need, let's say you're a salesman and you have 4,000 SKUs and a new price list, you could spend a half a day and memorize all of those items and all of the prices, so that when you're sitting out on a sales call, you can just spit them out at the top of your head. And if that's beneficial to your day-to-day life, then yes, that's worth doing. If it's not, it's just as easy now in a literate world to pull out your price sheet and say, here's what it is. Although better, if you're in the high-end negotiation game, you might memorize the price list and also know what the cost is, so that you can come up with a number in a negotiation that keeps you, well above your nut, so that you're not taking a loss on a thing. And what your last one was, the bias of choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to kind of delve into what that is, but on the face of it, in this context, maybe your initial desire to pick that thing creates a stronger association with you, that it becomes a part of you. And I have a 12-year-old who doesn't want to give away her childhood toys because she has an associative memory of what those things were in the context of our home, and so doesn't want to, you don't want to get rid of your blankie because you have such a strong association with it. And possibly that's going on with what's there, but there are also, you know, research studies that show if you give people a line of things, and I suspect it's probably also a left brain, right brain. Are you left-handed or right-handed, and how's that? But we have usually a stronger preference for things that appear on the right, even above
Interesting.
what those toys may be. So there's a lot of crazy that's going on there that I don't think we really understand well. And you know, I'm out of my depth now on that topic, so I'll leave it to
Perfect.
somebody to research and come back. Dave?
Yeah, so a little bit of the riff on the associative memory piece, and this is kind of an unintentional associative memory aid, but one I find I return to more and more often, and sometimes it's intentional, but this thing we carry around in our pockets that has a camera built into it. And then add to the fact that I'm something of a hobbyist photographer and I take a lot of pictures. I have 100,000 images in my photos library, and they're all sorted. There's a whole host of metadata associated with them, most important of which being date. And so many times I can't recall something, but I know approximately when it happened, or sometimes it recalls or records the GPS location where it happened. I can go to the photo library and find images there that will restore that recall or facilitate it. Likewise, music, 10,000 songs in your pocket, create your own playlist. If you look at in iTunes, Apple Music, iTunes, the number of songs you've played the most frequently, that if you go back and revisit those, they will recall the associated events and feelings of that time. I think that I was a little taken back by your remark that without writing, thinking doesn't take place, or I may have the quote not exactly right. I think what indigenous people did, they certainly did think, and there are all different kinds of thinking. Einstein, with a very visual memory, he can imagine thought experiments of somebody moving at the same speed as a light ray and so forth. But those cultures that lacked the ability to write things down and then do that sort of combinatorial creative analysis and synthesis, I think that was the great advantage of writing and the invention of paper. And certainly could be done. It was done on papyrus. It was done on clay tablets, but where it really exploded was when paper became ubiquitous. And Yol, or whatever you mentioned, he was the 12th century. It looks like he's the 13th century, and he was in Spain. Is that where he was?
Yeah, I think
and that there were one of the best paper making places was in Spain. So I'm guessing that he made abundant use of paper at the time. Just reading that book now, I can't recall the name of. But we use the technology that is to hand, Yes, correct. And the Catalans conquered them because the king that wanted those two paper factories there. But we use what technology is available. I think the focus on memory today, to some extent, is anxiety about Alzheimer's. Where everybody wants to exercise their facility of recall because they're afraid that if they can't remember something, oh my God, I've got Alzheimer's. But I have no objection to relying on all these tools, writing stuff down, and then having things like this kind of record a plethora of trivia that you would never remember, but it's accessible to you if you need it. And it's doing much of the organization and structure for you in the background. So
yeah, well,
I'm not sure.
Certainly it structures that and it makes it easier. So one of the other things I wanted to kind of touch on today too is there is a rapidly ballooning area called behavioral economics out of the work of both Kahneman and Tversky. who frame things as a kind of they call it system 1 and system 2 for lack of a better name. And system 1 is your immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction to what's happening in the world around you, the things that you just do automatically. And system 2 is your kind of logical thinking space. So if you have to, for most people, if you have to multiply, 2-3 digit numbers, you won't have an immediate knee-jerk reaction, here's the answer, unless maybe you're Ramanujan. But you're going to need to take out a paper and a pencil and actually do some thinking work to write a thing down. That system 2 obviously takes a lot more mental and emotional work and labor to deal with. So if I give you my phone number, it's going to take you a little bit of work to memorize it and store it in and keep it in your long-term memory. It takes almost no effort whatsoever to write it down and put it in your pocket, or take my business card and walk away with it, and then you'll have it. And of those two choices, almost everyone will take the business card or write it down and walk away with it because it's simple and it's easy. Generally, as people, we don't like to do the extra work or the hard work that has no long-term benefit. But if you then map those ideas onto note-taking practice, if you're very good at what in the Middle Ages they called the ars excerpendi, the art of excerpting things, you read something, oh, that's interesting and useful, I want to remember it, and I don't have the time now, or I have to get this book back because I can't afford it, I can't buy it, it's not mine. So you write it down very quickly, you throw it into your notes, and then you file it away, or maybe you put it into a pile, which, historically is where we get the phrase scrap heap. You have scraps of paper you write your notes on, and you pile them up on your desk, and eventually you go through them or not, but oftentimes if your memory is poor and you go to that scrap heap, you find there's a lot of trash there and there's nothing you can do with it. But in that system 1, system 2 mapping, it's very easy for me while I'm reading something, oh, that looks interesting, I may want to use that or remember it later. I can highlight it and jot a quick note. In my case, I use hypothesis because it's a quick, easy thing. I can add 1 or 2 tags and I move on. Having made that part of my daily routine as I read almost anything has made it not a system 2 process, but a system 1 process. So I can throw a ton of stuff into a pile that I may or may not use later. Usually within a week, I'm reading in 1 or 2 specific areas. So those things may build up, and at the end of the week, I'll go back and revisit them and create a short paper or a blog post or a thing about it using all that stuff I've accumulated. And doing that helps me associate all those things within the area I'm working and create some type of output that others may benefit from. But really, 9 times out of 10, I'm writing it for my future self, so I remember it. Or I'm writing it as, this is the beginning of a paper, a journal article, a chapter, a thing that I'm going to add to later. But at least here is a conglomeration of something from all those little quick notes I took. The harder part is the moving those pieces around, the creating some logical system or structure out of them. That's where the work is. And that's the system 2 stuff that's much harder. It's going to more likely mentally exhaust you. So if you know those things are going on, and there's a famous quote that Niklas Luhmann, while he was doing his work, never felt like it was work. He always worked on the easy things. He was relying on his system 1 process to do the easy things that he knew, but because he was using his Zettelkasten, and the word I like to use is a ratchet, it's a, you know, a tool that, you know, your clock will always tick forward, it never ticks back because there's a ratchet mechanism to keep it from going the other direction. But his note box or your Tinderbox becomes a ratchet for all these ideas you collect. You know, sooner or later, you need to do a little bit of the work to tie them all together to create something or do something. Or maybe you just, it's a fun hobby and you know, flip through things just to have that extra, you know, external memory. And I think I've seen written examples. I think the earliest one I've seen is probably the mid 1600s, and it was written in Latin of someone using a phrase similar to external memory, second brain, second memory. I think in the 1600s case, it was probably best translated as a second memory, taking their notes. But I guarantee there's versions of that well before the 1600s. I just haven't seen any in my reading yet. But if you can use that ratchet method so that you keep the actual amount of thinking work you're doing very low, you can accumulate an awful lot of interesting stuff over time that then makes the system to work of organizing it and laying it out a lot easier. You know, there's a huge wealth of literature on the idea of flaneuring, or walking around with your thoughts. You have a
So let's just do a quick chime check, by the way. So what does everyone want to do? You want to maybe give us a wrap up in the next minute or two, and then let Mark Anderson do his 10 minutes of Tinderbox in 8 minutes or 7 minutes?
Yeah, we can do that.
I can do that anytime.
Or do we want to push that to some future date and keep going? What would the group like? Give me a thumbs up if you want to keep going, or do you want to hear about
Push Mark to the
push
future.
Mark off? All right, Mark, you're being punted to the future.
Not a chance.
All right.
Not a chance.
So you've got about we can go a little long, but you've got about 7 or 8 minutes or so, just, you know, and then we can and for those that want to stay longer, we can, but
and while we're at Lumen, I'll throw out a thesis that I've been slowly working at that is not frequently discussed it's certainly not in the baseline literature. But while we're thinking about the system 1 and system 2 and how much work does it take you to take a note and then do something with a note, and ideally, if you're an academic and doing this for a career, or you're a journalist or a writer who does this every day, how can you lower the work bar to as low as possible? Because it's not, you know, we have this idea of Homo economicus, you know, going back to, you know, Adam Smith. We're logical creatures, yes. But when you look at the history of humanity and how Homo economicus we actually really are, I would say we're far closer to animals than we want to give ourselves credit for. We have the ability to do logical thought, but doing that takes work, and no one likes to do the work. We're humans, really at our hearts, we're lazy animals. So doing the least amount of work possible is kind of the name of the game. What I see, everyone wants to talk about Zettelkasten since roughly 2013. And I would point to the Marbach exhibition in Germany as being like the kickoff point, because right after that, Christian and Sasha start Zettelkasten.de and start looking at Lumen and its practices, which people had kind of delved into before, and probably more so in German contexts than in non-German contexts. But most people are using what they call his method in digital spaces now. And almost no one is putting alphanumeric ID on their notes. And they may be linking them to other notes, but in broad strokes, we're creating digital commonplace books more so than we're creating Nicholas Lumen Artig note collections. Some digital tools are really good at giving you the affordances of what Luhmann was doing. And I would say he broadly was taking commonplace book tradition and a little bit of John Locke's indexing tradition and bolting onto it for his time and space Melville Dewey's Dewey Decimal System, which really wasn't so much his system, but a system that had started as far back as Francis Bacon, or a version of. So I have, you know, and it wasn't too long ago, I saw a critique of the Dewey Decimal System. I think it was David Weinberger saying, you know, it's a flawed system because Christianity is given this large swath of integer and Buddhism is given a tenth of a decimal space. And that's just wrong. And because of how that system was structured and systematized, there is this feeling that there is a bias placed into it. But if you want to remove the bias, move your decimal place over 3 spaces, and instead of doing 510 dot something, move it all the way over and suddenly it's 510 with whatever decimals you've got left. You're still in the area of math and it's all been decimalized, and who cares where it's at? Because even within the Dewey Decimal space, even if you give it, it's really not an integer, they're all decimals. And in that decimal space, from a mathematical perspective, there is infinite density. You can give me any 2 decimal numbers and I can always give you another decimal number that sits between them. Always. You know, because I'm a mathematician, I can usually come up with a couple million irrational numbers that also probably sit between those, but nobody's putting irrational numbers on their notes, you know, at least as far as I've seen.
Okay.
But where do you go from that? It's so Luhmann is creating neighborhoods of notes so he can put his hand in, pull out a chunk of cards, and write something because everything he needs is right there. And how do you do that in a digital space where, you know, I'm sure Tinderbox is giving a unique ID to every note you make, but you're probably never going to see it unless you delve into the database to find it.
And yeah, actually,
Unless you're
I
Michael
use it.
Becker.
Unless you're me, I use it in every note, and it's all part of my action code and all that. I actually use that to automate, like near everything I'm doing.
But yeah, you probably are the exception rather than the rule. But in the rest of the space, everybody's like, oh, I need to have a unique ID. So they put a date and timestamp on it. Well, in almost every computer system, that date and timestamp is on the file itself, or there's also a modified date and timestamp on it. Why are you doing that and adding that as an extra thing that's just 99.99 times out of 100? Doing that as a practice, you're creating extra overhead that you're never going to use. So why bother?
Right.
Default to system 1, make the thing easier. But by the simple fact of filing a card and giving it a number, Luhmann was placing it and automatically usually creating 2 links, a link to the thing that came before it, the card just before, or the card that came after it. Usually the link to the card that came before it is a lot stronger. But as you grow and expand, you have infinite expandability, but you always know that the thing you're looking for is going to be, you know, I'm hungry, I want to go eat. So in the city of Pasadena, there's lots of places I can eat, but I know if I go to Old Town Pasadena, there is a higher density of restaurants per building. So I don't need to really pick a place. I can just go to an area and I know within a block, I'm going to find food. That is a much simpler system one heuristic that I can rely on rather than thinking and taxing my brain in system two. Think of all the restaurants I can think of nearby within a half an hour. And then what am I hungry for? Or maybe I use the heuristic, what am I hungry for? And I may find that thing quicker. But if I don't know, or I'm going with a group of people, we could do way worse than go to Old Town Pasadena and within 3 blocks, we're guaranteed as a group to find something interesting. And
Yeah.
hopefully that's what Luman is doing with his index cards. He's relying on a easy system one filing setup, and the numbers in some sense really let him put things in or out of order or reorder his commonplace book. So when he wants to write about, complexity theory, he can go to a general space instead of going through 90,000 cards and picking out each one. So if you look at his index, you'll see that he has what I call a very sparse index. If you compare his index with, let's say, John Locke's commonplace book index, Locke's got index terms for a million things. So you go look up, happiness, let's say, you find 5,000 little numbers in there, and then you have to then go find those 5,000 ideas across maybe multiple books. That's a massive pain in the ass. And let's say my area is anthropology. If I start tagging everything with anthropology as I work, suddenly 5 years into my career, anthropology means nothing in my note-taking system because it's been overwhelmed. And even if as I progress, I do cultural anthropology, social anthropology, archaeological anthropology, and sub-ideas, even those will become overwhelmed. So if you think of tagging and categorization as a spectrum, and you're working in an area over time, putting broad categories on notes that you maybe touch once every 10 years is okay. But if it's your own special area, the best tag you can put on it is the tag that links it to some other immediately adjacent idea. And that's the most specific tag you can put. And 9 times out of 10, you will find over time, that's the best tag you can put on it. And I think a lot of people are throwing things into digital archives like, Obsidian or maybe Tinderbox, and they're not focusing on where is that going? And by doing that, you're pushing the work further down the road and creating a massive amount of work to cull through your notes to create something versus doing that work up front, which is what Luman did, which then made spitting it all back out that much easier. And it's very rare that people are talking about these. And in some part, it's because people will dip into it, they'll play for 6 months. This is not for me. But under the presumption, I think most of the people here today are not just drive-by users, but multiple decade users. Those types of affordances for lowering the amount of taxing mental work you're doing on a day-to-day basis really becomes the key to having more interesting long-term outputs. Make your system as stupidly simple as you possibly can so that more of your work is in system one, common in system one, than it is in system two. And that ratchet effect over time gets you where you want to go.
Well, and just and just to kind of wrap up my thought on that, and is we often will think that our value is generated in our output, like report, or I wrote that book. And what I've learned over the years, and kind of accelerated over the last couple of years, is the value is actually not in the output. The output is just the byproduct of your value. You actually are creating the value in those early steps, what you were talking about. You're creating value when you're collecting and curating and creating new ideas and collaborating with others. That's all of that's where value is created. Your output's just the byproduct. And as soon as you start realizing that, you start, wait a minute, it's worth me adding that extra 10 minutes when I'm collecting that piece of information to tag it and cite it and get the citation and all of that. Because to your point, you're being kind to your future self, right? Because you never really ever go back. You never really figure it out. Or if you do, you end up spending 3 times more time, and multiples amounts of more time than you would have otherwise.
Yeah, it's a good example of it. There's a YouTube video of Victor Margolin writing, he wrote a multi-volume book on the history of design. And he broadly uses an index card-based handwritten system from start to finish. But some of what he's doing, as I watch him doing it, he's punting a lot of the work to a later time point instead of doing it now while it's much easier and much more within his grasp of the context in which he's working. And you can either do the work now or you can do all the work later. But if you know why you're using your system and what you're using it for to generate something in a particular area, you at least have some idea where you're going and why you're collecting this thing.
Yeah.
So do the easy low bar level work now because you'll have the benefit of doing it later. And then the rest is all just some light reorganization and spitting it out. But there's also the example, SD Goitin had a really heavy index card based system. His only amounted to about 30,000 index cards. And he was doing research on the Cairo Geniza and translation of manuscripts from, I want to say it was like the 8th century to about the 13th century and less as he went on. But he had 1/3 of the number of notes Niklas Luhmann did and had almost 3 times the amount of written output that Niklas Luhmann made. And his system was even simpler. It was more of a commonplace book card index setup. And his value all went onto the cards to the point that modern researchers in those areas have digital copies of all of his index cards that they use as regular reference tools. And I know almost nobody except the people who are doing super deep research on Niklas Luhmann himself who actually use his index cards for anything. So to be a scholar whose set of notes is well done enough that scholars 100 years after you're gone are still using them, much less the text you actually wrote with those cards, to me, that is the fun holy grail.
Yeah. Okay. Shall we wrap it up? We're a little bit about 8 minutes over. You want to give one parting comment or one sentence to say to leave us so we don't just shut it off?
I don't erase what you don't know about, I think is the thing that, especially with respect to a lot of these indigenous cultures, they go much deeper than we are ever going to be willing to give them credit for.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. That was great. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have you back one of these days.
Well, I pop up, from time to time, depending on what the schedule is. So, I'm around with respect to next week's talk. I actually know Jack Beatty pretty well, and I personally am heavily ensconced in the indie web movement of having your own website, owning all of your own data so you can do with it what you want. I've been doing that for decades. So you can find me on my website or other social spaces. Usually most of those social spaces feed back to my website. So if you ping me on Mastodon, I see the notification through my website rather than through Mastodon. So
You're in my RSS.
By the way, on your point of owning your own data, all of my commercial work is on the future of personal data and identity, and how we're getting self-sovereign, how we need to and are in the process of getting self-sovereign control over our identity in tools like a personal information management system, which I'm just now finishing my doctorate on. Should be done in about 2 weeks. So it's a really fascinating example. Can you drop drop your Zotero link into the chat before we forget?
Oh, yeah, let me pull that up real quick.
Okay. And yeah, this was fun. I think I've got most of, or I shouldn't say most, I got maybe a tenth of your references and comments, but should be, I'm going to see if, and share a lot of the links.
The vast majority of my notes are, or at least digital ones, are publicly available, so you can sift through any topic I mentioned and find, entry points into deep, heavy literature, but know that it's all decontextualized. So I may make some really wild comment that means something to me that has nothing to do with the thing that it's linked to. So you may have to flush around the area a little bit to
It's like a
depending on
rabbit
what
making an
what
obscene
my
gesture
meaning
in the
actually
margins.
was.
And I just clicked on the link you gave us. So this is a Zotero database or a hypothesis database?
No, that's my hypothesis notes.
Okay.
I am pulling up my tools for thought collection. Through this. Hopefully this will work. You may have to ask for permission. You'll need a Zotero account and ask for permission, and then I'll approve you and let you in. I mentioned briefly that you saw it here. So there's been 1 or 2 people who've gotten into it and usually get permission to add or modify things. So I try not to let crazies in. But you also find a handful of some of the people who are working in tools for thought also in that shared database. So feel free to do that. And if that doesn't work, let me know, and I'll put a better link into the forum on today's set of notes.
Well, it worked fine for me. I got it. So it's good.
Thank you so much.
All right. Again, thank you. Bye-bye. See everybody.